Welcome to another episode of the Next Gen VC, a podcast from Gen Zs to Gen Zs. We aim to be the transparent window in the mysterious world of VCs and startups through authentic conversations with the very individuals that make them. If you enjoy our content, do support us by hitting the subscribe button and give us a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram at Next Gen VC Pod for updates on the latest episodes. Today, we're joined by Andreas, who will be helping us uncover the mysterious world of limited partners and the role they play in the venture and startup ecosystem. Andreas is only in his early 20s, but has spent time working in both venture and as an LP, currently at Multiple Capital. With a variety of insights into the evolving nature of the venture ecosystem and what LPs look for when investing into funds, Andreas will be discussing life as a Gen Z LP.
Hi, Andreas. Welcome to Next Gen VC. Great to have you with us. Could you start off by telling us a little bit more about yourself, where you came from, and how you ended up as an LP?
Hey guys, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm Andreas, I'm 22. I'm based in Frankfurt, Germany. I've been following the venture capital industry for about three and a half years. And I've been working in VC for, I think, a little over 2 years. I first got into VC when I was studying for my bachelor's. I was studying banking and finance. And I noticed that I wasn't as passionate about it as some of my other fellow co-students. What I was always passionate about was tech and startups. And that's where I tried to focus my career on. And that's how I got to be a working student for a small fintech VC here in Frankfurt, I think almost a year. And afterwards, I joined my incubator, the CVC of Commerzbank, the early stage CVC of Commerzbank, as a full-time intern. And for the last 6 or 7 months after I finished my bachelor, I joined Multiple Capital, a fund here in Frankfurt.
Before we go into Multiple Capital, I think it's really interesting how you joined a venture fund while you were in uni. At least in London, it really isn't common. Do you think that's something that's more common in Germany? And how did you even land that role?
I landed at the role by asking. The original job description that I had was for a 3 months internship. And I had no time to do a full-time internship because my next semester was about to start. So I just wrote the VC and asked them, or basically told them, I think you're great. I would be perfect for that position. Would you mind hiring me as a working student? It's a long-term thing. You don't have to look for a replacement immediately. And it made a lot of sense for them. So they hired me. And I don't know if that's more common in Germany. I would say working student positions are more common, but VCs usually don't do that. So I think that was rather an exception.
That's super cool though. But what was it like actually just balancing working in a VC and studying? Because VC is, especially when you're on a deal, it's very fast paced and you can really be around the clock trying to get stuff signed.
It was actually very great. It can be stressful at times, especially at the beginning when you have to handle university and work. But once you find a balance, it's actually quite nice. And my VC was very, very flexible, so I could work whenever I had time, and that probably played a huge role. But I very much enjoyed it. Yeah.
And then now maybe going back to Multiple Capital, can you tell us a little bit more about, what LPs are and why did you decide to join an LP and not, continue working for a VC?
An LP is a limited partner. It's the opposite of a general partner. It comes from the limited partnership. That's usually the structure a fund has. And limited basically means that you have a smaller role. You basically just provide the money. And the general partners manage a fund. They're the VCs. I joined an LP because I met Ertan and got to know what Multiple Capital does. And I thought it was incredibly smart. And just investing in micro VCs all over Europe was just a great opportunity that I wanted to take.
It's definitely, something very uncommon to be an LP so early on because, in especially emerging funds, most LPs are family offices or pension funds or even fund of funds. But, they've gone through the cycle of probably being a banker or more likely being a VC themselves, and then after a while transitioned into being an LP. So what's it like kind of working alongside other LPs, and what's it like kind of being so young within that side when you're probably and potentially investing in GPs who are much older than you?
Yeah, that's a common thing. I always heard that as a VC, you have to go to investment banking or consulting, and that's where you learn all the skills, and then you can be a VC. But I always thought it was kind of stupid to do something for 2 or 3 years that you're not passionate about, so you can actually do what you're passionate about. So I think I'm incredibly lucky to get into VC immediately, like right after my studies. It's difficult, but I think it's the right way to do it. If you really want to do something and you're passionate about startups, why waste time? That's how I think about it. I have the age bias a lot of times. I think I've met with a lot of GPs who thought I was an intern, didn't take me too serious because they wanted to speak to a partner. It happens, but I also noticed the opposite, that some people take me too serious and treat me like a partner, which is kind of nice. Yeah, usually we have older general partners or people in their 30s or 40s. It's weird, but after a while you get used to it. And I think after my first or second call with partners, it's just normal. I think it's something that you have to get over with, but it shouldn't be a problem. I think young people are as qualified or even more qualified than people who went into consulting and investment banking. We also have put our time in, and I think it shouldn't be a problem.
The imposter syndrome is definitely something that many people feel, regardless if you're an LP, GP, or an intern in a startup or even in a VC. But I'm interested to hear, what is the role of a LP like day to day?
I have a lot of responsibilities because our team is very lean and very small. It's a classic thing that you can imagine, the investment side of a fund, the finding potential VC funds that we can invest in. So the sourcing, meeting with GPs, the due diligence part, writing investment memos, but it's also a lot of operations, the kind of behind the scenes, looking at reportings, looking at capital call and cash flow management. Because when you hear that someone raised 100 million fund, that money doesn't lie in our bank accounts. We send money to our VCs when they ask us for money, basically when they invest. And we have then to go to our investors and ask them to send us money. So it's a lot of push and pull. And managing that is basically what happens behind the scenes. We also do a lot of fundraising. And I noticed that fundraising is also kind of a lot of marketing. So how do you present yourselves, working on your pitch deck, working on your website, on your presence online? That are things that younger people can probably do better than older people, I would say. That's where my younger perspective is very helpful, I would say.
As an LP, from a VC perspective, it's hard to come across LPs. It's hard to find them. Sometimes they are just like family offices who don't do marketing and who just kind of sit in the back and know where they're going to invest already. But to get hired as an LP is hard because sometimes you don't even know who the LPs in certain funds are. How did you actually go about finding multiple capital and kind of getting hired by them? And do you have any advice for people who might want to work on the LP side of VC but don't know where to kind of start off looking?
I think that is by design, that LPs don't want to be found. Most of them are not focused on VC funds or generally being an LP in VCs. There are often endowment funds, pension funds, insurances, even banks, or just high net worth individuals. They don't have a clear focus on that. It's just something they are able to do because they have basically the money to invest. So they're not advertising that because it would create so much noise for them. Fund of funds are, I would say, most often the only ones who have a clear focus and they want to be seen. It's also not as easy as finding an investor for your startup, but it's definitely easier to find one. My job was kind of an accident. My first boss from my working student position, Jan Claudio, he's a partner at Backbone Ventures. He was fundraising for his own fund, and he met Ertan through that. And they talked, and Ertan told him about a junior position that he has at multiple. And Jan Claudio recommended me. So I had to choose between my semester abroad, doing a master's, or multiple capital. And as I already told you, after meeting Ertan, I had to be part of that. So it was quite an easy decision and very, very lucky for me to get a position at an LP. So nothing that I really looked for, but it just happened along the way. And I'm incredibly lucky for that. If people want to be an LP, I think if you just want to be one for venture capital, looking for positions at fund of funds would be the best way. You can do that for high net worth individuals or family offices, but that comes with a lot of other investment criteria or investment properties. So not just venture capital. So if you want to be very, very focused on VC, I think fund of funds are the way to go.
Andreas, could you share a little bit more about the process itself? Because the process of getting into VC is mysterious enough, and it seems like LP is just a whole different world. Would you say that the process is quite similar, or what sort of steps did you have to go through, and what did they ask in interviews?
It was just a series of casual conversations, I would say, just checking off boxes that I know how venture capital works. I think that's the most important thing. You can't expect people to be a perfect LP right away. There's a lot of learning that you need to do. But I think just showing that you might be less qualified, but more ambitious than other people is important. I would much rather work with someone who is less qualified, but more eager to learn. And I think that attitude played a big role in how I got my job.
And for our listeners who are kind of considering starting their own fund as a VC, could you share how you go about choosing funds to invest in and how the whole process from your perspective works when you decide, hey, look, there is this fund and it looks super cool and we want to invest? How do you go about that?
We usually start with our investment criteria. So the fund needs to be small, a micro VC, somewhere between 5 and 50 million fund size. And they need to invest early, so seed stage or prior. That's our key criteria. And afterwards, we just look for funds that are unique. I know that doesn't really say a lot, but there's so many funds out there that we look for someone who's special or some people who are doing something different and unique and that we think have a great ability to source funds. Key question for VC funds is always, how are you able to get access to the best deals out there? You need a competitive edge, your USP. And if you don't have that, or if you're not able to communicate that, LPs won't like your fund. After we found that, it's a lot of due diligence, talking to the founders or general partners, getting an impression of how well they do. Because at the beginning of a fund, you basically just have a pitch deck, a thesis, and the promise that they want to do their best. And that's what you're judging them on, or basically also their track record. We start with that and do our due diligence. Then there comes a lot of technical terms and the structure and legal and compliance part, which is less interesting, but also very important for an LP. Yeah, that's kind of how the process goes.
Can you tell us about an interesting fund that you've invested in?
We're not mentioning our investments that much, but there are a couple of funds that I think are very, very interesting. My favorite investment was Remote First Capital. It's a fund of Andreas Klinger, the CTO of OnDeck. He's investing in future of work startups, and he has a unique edge because he's an operator. He has founded startups. He knows the people he's going to invest in. He had an incredible track record, and he's just someone that we believe in, and we think he's going to become an outlier fund, or we hope so. And so far, it looks very, very promising.
You do fundraising. Does that mean that you have your own LPs and then you use their money to invest in others? Is that how it works?
That's basically how it works. So we're also fundraising. Basically, we're also going to the same people as the funds that we invest in, which sounds very crazy, but it's how we do it. And we just pitch a different product. We don't pitch one fund. We pitch 30 funds combined in one. And our expertise and our diversification factor that we bring in. It's something different, but it's the same target group.
How do you sort of persuade, and apologies if this is a very ignorant question, but how do you go about to persuade the funds that you're investing in to not just go straight to, the LPs that invest in you?
I think it's a differentiation. You don't have to convince us that crypto is a great sector. You don't have to convince us that Latin America as a market is very interesting. We know that. We look for that. We understand what venture capital is. And a lot of fundraising is explaining to people who don't know what venture capital is, what it can do, and that it's very, very profitable, but also risky. And that's the part that they don't like to hear. And for people who don't understand what we do, it sounds crazy when you say we want to invest in startups and we expect 70% to fail. But don't worry, the 30% that gonna make it, they're gonna return 3x on the capital that you give us. It sounds crazy. So the convincing part is the difficult part for VC funds. And if you go to someone who understands that already, the conversations that you're going to have are way easier. And that's probably what they like about fund of funds.
Got it. And why did Multiple Capital decide to focus on, early stage and micro funds?
It's something we noticed while during our first investments. Small VC funds just perform better. It's scientifically proven, and there are a lot of reasons. It's the fund size mainly, because it's easier to return less capital. You don't need to have huge exits. On average, I think startups return less than 100 million, or most startups, about 60%, return less than 100 million. You're not going to return a fund with that. So if you have a 500 million fund, you need a lot of unicorns, a lot of decacorns. But if you're smaller, you don't need that. Smaller exits can return more money for you. And that's basically the main reason. But there's also another effect that the people who are raising small funds are oftentimes emerging managers. It's their way into VC. And when it's your first chance, it's your only chance. You have to prove that you're able to make it. So there's a lot of pressure on them, and they need a hustler mentality to make it in VC. And that's the promising thing about emerging managers. They are more eager, they're more hungry for success. And that also plays a role in why multiple capital works so well.
Are you seeing certain types of emerging managers come about? So, ex-operators, for instance, and those who are kind of coming from, big tech unicorns, or those which have just exited, rather than just your typical VC who has worked up the analyst associate, ladder and then got to the point where actually it's time to start my own fund kind of thing.
There are two trends for emerging managers that we see across Europe. The first one, as you said, are operators that notice they have a great network, also probably did some angel investments and who want to turn into VCs. They're very promising. And the other group that we see are people leaving major VC brands and starting their own thing. We invest in a lot of solo GPs, so VC funds where there's only one manager and basically one person who invests. And they often come from larger top brand VCs, your Early Bird, your Cherry, I don't know. And they want to start their own thing. They're driven to have their own, basically compensation, their own carry. And they also have the expertise that they got from big brands and basically the VCs where they learned how to invest. And they're seasoned investors, I would say, that do their own thing.
But do you think it's riskier investing in kind of solo GPs? Because at least if you were to invest in a fund and they had multiple GPs and one GP kind of decided, actually, you know what, I'm going to pull out, at least there's still people committed to the vision, to the thesis, and then in the long term still going to bring back those returns.
There are a lot of people who say it's riskier. I don't think that's necessarily true. There's always a risk that someone after 3 or 4 years says, I'm going to quit, I'm going to start a job, the VC, I'm no longer interested. It might happen. But I think if you're creating your first fund, if you're not good at it, you're not going to have a second fund. And in VC, everything is about relationships, and you don't want to ruin relationships, especially not with people who give you money. So we haven't seen people leaving their solo VC. And I don't think that will happen.
And back to the sort of operator versus investor kind of GP, what sort of questions do you ask them to identify whether they're a good emerging manager? Is it different between the two types of GPs, or would you say that it's pretty much similar?
It's very much similar. We're looking for unique edge. Sometimes it's clear if you're an operator what that edge is, but you still need to be able to communicate it. So if you're an investor, if you're a scientist or an operator, the questions will be similar, or basically the same. And we evaluate funds after those criteria, and you have to make or convince us either way, no matter if you're an operator or something else.
And it's really interesting because you mentioned the fund which you really liked and how they focus on future of work. There are more and more funds coming about which are kind of very sector specific or revolve around a certain vertical. Do you see this trend continuing? And if so, which sectors do you see more funds emerging in?
We see a lot of funds who specialize, and I think that's a good thing. You need specialist funds who understand a certain business model or a certain technology. Right now, there's a lot of things happening in blockchain and crypto, which is very interesting. We also invest in that. But there's also happening a lot of things in classic established sectors like life science. They received a lot of attention through COVID and the investments that we see in companies like BioNTech. And yeah, I think that's going to continue in the future, that we see specialist funds. And it's better than, I would say, than generalists.
In terms of building up experience, because you've done that across both VC and now on the LP side, do you have any advice for someone who has no experience in VC at all, but knows, has some interest in the area, knows they kind of want to learn more about what to do to kind of break in. If you say put yourself back in your own shoes, but when you were like, I don't know, 18, 19.
I got incredibly lucky because I had someone who taught me all those things through my working student position. But if you can't do that, the knowledge is out there. I think if you just look on the internet and look for what is a cap table, how do investments work, you will find answers. And that's also the way how I taught myself, just not only learning at the job, but learning by yourself at home and like really putting the work in. That's one part, learning the basics, but there's also relationships. I think nowadays it's very easy to join student initiatives or online communities or Slack groups like GenZ VC and just talk to like-minded people. More interested students or younger people should also just talk directly to VCs. It sounds intimidating, but it's actually possible. Just go to events or contact them and ask them if they want to meet for coffee or just have a quick chat. They're going to be very happy to talk to people who are interested in VC. That's how you can build your network and start your journey if you're very, very interested in VC.
I guess one more question before we hit the quick fire round. You know how there's that continuous debate on do you need to be an operator before you can be a good investor? Do you think you have to have had worked at a VC to be a good LP?
I don't think so. Mostly because I haven't worked for a startup, but also if you like the industry, you can still analyze companies from a more objective view. You don't need to 100% understand certain things. I think if you don't have experience as an operator, you probably can't do investments in life science. You need expertise. You can also probably not do the IT or blockchain thing. But there are things that you have expertise in. Consumer tech. We are all consumers. I think that's something that we can all evaluate. And then there are some topics where you can basically learn on the job and read enough material to gain knowledge about a certain sector. I think mobility is one of them. Fintech is one that I got for myself. So you don't need to have worked at a startup necessarily. I think it helps, but it's not a must. Definitely not.
And now it's time for the quick fire round. So we've got a bunch of questions we're going to ask you, and you have about 20 to 30 seconds to answer each one. Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
First of all, if you could live in any city in the world, where would it be?
I always wanted to live in London. I think there's something beautiful about the UK. I never had the chance, but I would very much like to live there.
That's super cool. London is fun.
Right, next question. If you weren't in a VC or an LP, what would you be doing?
I think I would probably work for a startup. Or found my own startup. I'm very interested in fintechs and neobanks. That's also what I wrote my bachelor thesis about. I think I would be doing something in that direction.
Tell us more about your bachelor's thesis.
I wrote a thesis about how challenger banks can become profitable. It sounds very boring, but it's very interesting because we have huge neobanks like Revolut or N26, and they're all collecting a lot of money from VCs and spending it left and right. But without becoming profitable, they're not going to compete against incumbents. And I looked at different ways how they can become profitable and if they even can become profitable.
That's super cool. And if there's one German startup which you're super excited about, what would it be?
I would say I'm very excited about Tomorrow. That's a neobank that's green alternative to normal banks. Their USP is basically that all of your money is not invested in oil, weapons, or anything that's immoral. They invest in green initiatives, or they're basically a green bank. And I think the best alternative that's out there.
That's very interesting. And this is something that definitely comes up more and more in many conversations that we have. And next question, why don't you tell us one place that everyone has to visit in Germany instead?
My hometown, Ulm. It's the city between Baden-Württemberg and Bayern, so 2 states in the south of Germany. And it has the highest church tower in the world. It's very incredible, and it has an amazing old town where you can see very little small streets and go shopping. And it has a Danube, so amazing view, and a river. It's perfect for the summer. I think everyone should check that out.
And if you had any advice for your 18-year-old self, what would it be?
That's an easy one. Get your hands on as many books, articles, and podcasts as you can. We live in an amazing age where everyone can basically share, or there are thousands of people who share their knowledge, their experience, their biggest successes and biggest failures. There's so much to learn from, and I wish that's something that I would have started sooner. I'm still young, but still, I wish I would have started doing that at a very, very young age.
Before we let you go, Andreas, can you share with us some of your gold mines on, what's your favorite book, your favorite podcast to learn about all these amazing things?
My favorite book is Smoke and Mirrors. It's a book about hype, and it looks at hype in different industries and how hype can be a good thing or a bad thing in ways that you haven't thought about it. For example, the food tech industry and what sustainability in food tech means and how we're actually doing bad things for farmers, or batteries, cancer research, how hype can be good but also bad. I think that's something that people should read. It's a very great book.
Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It was great chatting and learning more about your journey into venture and then into being an LP. And I'm sure our listeners have found this really insightful.
Thanks for having me, guys. It was really great. A lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Next Gen VC, a podcast from Gen Z to Gen Z. If you enjoy our content, do support us by hitting the subscribe button and give us a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram at Next Gen VC Pod for updates on the latest episodes. We'd also love to hear your suggestions on guests and topics you want to hear about. So feel free to get in touch with us on any of our social media platforms, linked in the description box down below.